Welcome, everyone. Welcome to iNet Live. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of The Hill in Washington, D.C. We have a fantastic forum today as part of the Future of Work series. This is actually, we're titled this, The Work of the Future, How Will Work Be Different? We've got a global panel. I couldn't imagine a better panel than we have from essentially California. We've got Erik Brynjolfsson, who's director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. He's co-author of so many books on this topic today. It's hard to mention, but some of my favorites are The Second Machine Age, The Race Against the Machine Platform Crowd. Many of these he co-authored. I think all of these he co-authored with my friend at MIT, Andrew McAfee, who's another insightful mind on these topics. And we have Nancy Fulbrey, who's professor emerita of economics at UMass Amherst, the director of the program on gender and work at the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst as well. She's a senior fellow at the Levy Economic Institute at Bard College, and she was a MacArthur Fellow. I guess you're once a MacArthur Fellow, always a MacArthur Fellow, which means she's our MacArthur genius on this topic, has done so much on gender and work and caregiving, such important parts of the economy that don't often get discussed as we think about technological advancement. And then joining us from Beijing, and I think he's got the best connection actually, is Kaifu Lee, author of the must-read AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. Just a few words about Kaifu. He developed the first continuous speaking recognition system. So, I mean, he's part of why we're able to do this today. So thank you for that, Kaifu. He's been at Apple, SGI, Microsoft, was president of Google China. He's got 50 million followers on his blog. That gives me something to aspire to. And he's chairman and CEO of Sinovation Ventures and president of the Sinovation Ventures Artificial Intelligence Institute. I want to remind all of you that through this session and our discussion, you can go to the Q&A panel and post your Q&A at any time. And we're going to get to those questions. I may weave some of them in early if you're brilliant, but we'll definitely have time for Q&A after our early discussion. But let me just ask Erik, when we think about this subject of technological transition, the inflection point for society as we sit on the edge of so many strategic leaps, I think, on what technology can do for society. And I have to put my own bias here. I said, I see enormous change coming in communications, in science, in health, across the board. But I also feel if Galileo were around today, he would still be found guilty. And so it's one of these challenges where there are stress points, and we often have debates between, is the future going to be dystopian or utopian? I mean, where will the stress points be? So if you could lay out what's coming, and then we can respond to that. So can you help set the stage for us?
Sure. Well, first, thanks to iNet for inviting us all. I'm really honored to be on this panel with the rest of you. And that's a great question, Steve. Something really fundamental is happening in the economy. We have more billionaires and millionaires than ever before in history, but millions of people are being left behind. So the labor markets aren't working the way they used to. And all of us just right now, we're on Zoom. I did a study at the beginning of the year, about 15% of Americans work from home. Now it's over 50%. You see it in capital markets where the five most valuable companies, the seven most valuable companies, if you count the Chinese ones on the planet, are all mainly digital companies. The kinds of goods and services that we consume, more free goods and services that don't show up in GDP and aren't counted. And I know Nancy's done some work on the big chunks of the economy that we aren't measuring correctly. So there are a lot of changes going on. My view is that the driver behind many of these is the digitization of almost everything, and particularly the role of artificial intelligence. Digital goods and services are fundamentally different than the things made of atoms that most of the economists studied for the past couple of hundred years. You could call them free, perfect, and instant in that they have zero marginal cost. Each copy is an exact replica of the other ones. And as we can see with Kaifu coming in from Beijing, you can communicate anywhere on the planet and share these digital goods at the speed of light. So those are three characteristics, free, perfect, and instant, that we never use to describe other goods. And they're leading to some big changes in the competitive landscape. At the same time, we have some amazing tools to understand them better. But this restructuring that we're in the middle of, I think ultimately is going to be significantly bigger than even the Industrial Revolution. And as Kaifu Lee has pointed out, it's already happening a lot faster as well.
Well, thank you. But I think as you laid, I'm just ask you before I jump to Nancy, kind of, help me understand some of what she sees as the stress points. When you talk about free, perfect, and I forget what the third term is. There's another dimension to this. What there are other dimensions is they're also, everyone's digital life is, more transparent, more, there are vulnerabilities in the system. So before I jump to Nancy, can you talk about what some of as we move to such a digital world where everything is digitized, what are some of the stress points regarding how we interact with that and what the vulnerabilities are?
Well, the one that I focus most of my work on, and I think we're going to hear a bit about, is the growing tensions and inequality and the nature of work. The kinds of, I don't think we're going to see the end of work anytime very soon, but we are seeing already major restructuring of work and a lot of reallocation as we try to figure out which things machines are good at and which things humans still, and I think for a long time, will have an advantage at. But another one you just touched on is the nature of privacy and our digital lives. You walk around with one of these devices, and it's continually spewing a cloud of information about you, where you are, who you're talking to, at some level, even your thoughts and wishes and desires. And a lot of companies, and in some cases governments, are taking a look at that. Before the digital world, the laws of physics prevented people from coming into my office and looking in my file cabinets unless they had a key. Now that information is potentially freely available, so we can't rely on the laws of physics. We're going to have to either rely on laws that we make up ourselves or new rules, or in some cases, encryption. But there's a whole set of new norms, expectations, rules, institutions that we're going to have to invent. Right. And we're doing that a lot more slowly than the technologies are being invented.
Thank you for that. Nancy, how do you see the coming wave of technological change? I mean, you work in so many of the areas of identity, of caregiving, of, some of the, I don't know how to call it, but so many key parts of our economy that are intangible, and would be interested to sort of look at what you fear could be the impacts or what you want to embrace as the impacts.
Well, as a starting point, I think it's really useful to think about the care sector of the economy. So about 30% of our employed labor force is in health, education, or social services. And these are jobs that traditionally have had a lot of face-to-face contact, emotional connection, first name basis stuff. Plus, another important part of the care sector is the unpaid work that people are doing at home. And we know from time use surveys, that's about 50% of all the work that gets done, just absolutely outside the market economy. So what the pandemic has done is it's created a huge price shock to the care sector. And the care sector is adapting in some really good ways. And technology is part of that. So being able to work remotely, as Erik points out, yes, that's an example of a positive adaptation. But it's also created some really huge stresses. And the stresses of working from home when you often have to supervise young children or take care of family members is a really good example of that stress. And it's kind of missing from the way economists think about what's going on.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to jump to Kaifu Lee, but I want to give a little bit more preamble as we talk about what AI and technology will be able to do for us, what it won't be able to do for us. And I just want to share with the audience, because I just read your powerful piece about this, Kaifu, I think it was called The Blueprint of Human and AI Coexistence, in which you share, and so I'm going to share it, your kind of near-death experience and how it transformed your own understanding of what this is. So I'd love you to bring that into the conversation, because I think that human dimension, as Nancy just shared, is a very important element of what the limitations of AI and this technology might be. Kaifu, I think you're muted.
Yep. Okay, sure.
There we go. Okay.
As I worked on AI for the last almost 40 years, I recently began to realize that more and more of the work can be done by AI. And AI is an omni-use technology that within a single domain can collect a lot of data and take over various types of workloads. And I think from certainly for certain types of jobs, such as scientists, reporters, and they could use AI tools, and for a symbiotic combination. And certain types of jobs, whether it's teachers or doctors, there's also different ways where we can combine the best of human and AI, but also inevitable are many workloads that are basically repetitive and routine, and that these would be most conveniently taken over by AI because these are not jobs people necessarily want to have in the long term. And during tough economic times, CEOs and entrepreneurs are going to be looking at ways to reduce the cost for running the company. So under increasing pressure to downsize as AI technologies such as RPA, robotic process automation, is able to take over a lot of back office and customer service and different types of jobs. So to answer your point about the near-death experience and about the service types of work, I was in a quandary as I'm in investment, and we have been over the last 8 years funding companies that are doing technologies and products. Probably half of the AI companies we fund are building things that replace workloads. And one could argue they're making people more productive, but at the end of the day, if you only have a need for 100 of some type of job, and you make everybody twice as productive, then you'll only end up with 25 people. So it is job replacement. So I was very much excited about building these technologies and creating value, but also very concerned about the job displacement. So I referred back to a period of time in my life when I faced a serious illness. I had lymphoma, and during my treatment, I had a number of epiphanies, and I think the major one is that I've really spent a large part of my life being more like a robot. So repeating to do things, to maximize my impact, to complete certain types of things, and it's very mechanical. And it was only when that I may face death in a matter of hundreds of days, I realized that the things that really matter are the human connections, the love and connections with family and friends. And that made me realize that all this routine work, repetitive work, really isn't what we humans are supposed to do. And that probably even more important than finding creative work for people to do is finding ways for people to connect to each other, to help each other, especially the loved ones. And that, I think, connects back to Susan's point that human-to-human connection is something that robots and AI will never be able to do. And maybe the fact that there is job displacement is a chance for humanity to find that our root and our purpose of having a life on the earth is really more about the love and the connections. And I think the types of service and care work is very much centered around that.
Steve, you're muted.
Can't hear you, Steve.
Sorry about that. I didn't want to cover, hey, everybody, I'm back here. Thank you so much for your candor and for sharing that, Kaifu. And I wanted to come back to Nancy and just ask you, about that care economy. Does that care economy, I guess part of my bearings in this, which I'm trying to get this discussion is, does the care economy survive and do well because AI and technology can't, as Kaifu just laid out, do those tasks? So to some degree, they become an oasis in this discussion, or is it, or do they get left behind because of it? Yeah.
Yes and no. That's exactly really what I wanted to talk about. In principle, in theory, we wouldn't have a job displacement problem because we could reallocate people from all these boring routine jobs to real human service intensive jobs in education and healthcare, in scientific research, in averting climate change. There's just no shortage of really important jobs that need to be done. Okay, the problem is really very different from the technological question about AI. It has more to do with our social software, our economic programs, the algorithms that we use to allocate labor. And right now, we just don't have enough. We have a very market-driven economy that's very much shaped by income inequality, and there's an unwillingness for people to actually pay for the services that would be most socially productive. And that's a problem we need some really good AI to solve that problem for us, because that's what's standing between us and the potential to really enjoy an enormous increase in our productivity.
Erik, how do you see the soft side? You also look at the disproportionate way in which AI benefits some in society, impacts and isn't helping others. You know, I happen to have people in my extended family. One who's a caregiver. He's a nurse in an elder care facility. Really loved, makes no money, but really a lovely, loving guy. Mm-hmm. And then another. We have a new truck driver in our family who's driving trucks. And I look at both of them and say, okay, how is this going to impact? But then as you going to get broader at society and you look at what Kaifu was talking about before his epiphany, those people who were able to be in that high octane, high productivity, that, fast chart are going to do extremely well. Those that are not, for whatever reason, I think the question is, what does AI do? Does it make people victims, or does it bring people along and empower many more people and drive society in the aggregate to a much better place?
Well, that's the multi-trillion-dollar question. And the answer is that AI doesn't do things. We use AI to do things. Right. So remember, AI is a tool, and we can use it in lots of different ways, just as technologies throughout history. We can use it to increase concentration of wealth and power. We can use it to leave a lot of people without livelihoods, or we can use it in ways that benefit people broadly. And I want to, change it from the passive voice to the active voice as much as possible in terms of how we use these tools. Both Nancy and Kaifu underscored a really important point, which is that we're very far from what researchers call artificial general intelligence, this AI that can just do everything like you see in Hollywood movies. What we have is incredibly powerful, narrow AI that can, in some cases, do tasks much better than humans. But the big question is, which tasks does AI have real strengths in, and how do we use those? We did a study that we published in the journal Science, where we looked at 18,000 jobs in the economy, and each of them has about 20 to 30 distinct tasks. And believe it or not, we looked at each task and evaluated how suitable machine learning was to do some of those tasks. What we found was there was not a single occupation, including truck driver, where AI just ran the table of everything they can do. People talk about radiologists. Yes, AI can read medical images better, but radiologists do other things, including counseling patients, coordinating care with other physicians. In each case, there were some tasks where there was a human aspect to it or a creative aspect to it or both that required humans to still be involved. So what we're seeing is not the end of work, but a major restructuring of work. And depending on the choices of managers and CEOs, of policymakers, and of all of us, we can do that restructuring in a way that creates more broadly shared prosperity, or we could do it in a way that disempowers a lot of people. So I think that if there's one thing that people take away from this discussion, is that we do have the power to steer the economy one way or the other in the way that these tools are used.
If you wanted a guide path, Kaifu, one of the best that I've seen is your discussion of these quadrants of jobs, so that as people are looking at, what traits are going to be hard for a machine learning world to replicate, like compassion, creativity, empathy, and then beginning to look at where the future of our role would be, where those jobs might be, where there may be opportunities for maximization of those human dimensions. Can you talk a little bit about how you envision those quadrants and help our audience understand what drives you into different corners of those quadrants?
Certainly. So everybody will have to visualize a little bit, okay? So if we think about what types of things can AI not do? Not do presently and probably not do for some time to come. One is really an area of creativity. And along with that, thinking in multi-domains, common sense, and thinking strategically, analytically. So think about that as the x-axis. Okay, so extreme right would be the most creative type of job. Extreme left would be more routine, optimizing kind of jobs. Then the other aspect that AI cannot do is this human touch and trust, empathy and compassion. AI can fake it, but people won't accept it, and AI will make mistakes, which will make it laughable. So on the top of the axis would be jobs that require the most empathy, trust, compassion. The bottom would be work that don't require that. So that roughly divides the jobs into 4 categories. Then each category has one characteristic. For example, lower left category is low compassion and low creativity. These would be jobs like very straightforward back office processing, telemarketing, and also assembly line, people who work in factories for visual inspection. So these are jobs that are destined to be displaced by AI. Now, like Erik said, some of these jobs may have multiple components, and some people may hold on because they're good at doing the component that AI cannot do. I would say even radiologists' aspect of looking at the CT and MRI would fall in this lower left quadrant. So I think we need to tell people that these jobs are going to be gone and AI is going to take them over gradually. So people need to move to the other 3 quadrants. Then the lower right would be high creativity, but doesn't necessarily require a lot of human touch and compassion. So the job of a scientist or someone who discovers new drugs would be in this category. In this category, there are actually a lot of AI tools that could be used to make the people more productive for a symbiotic combination. A reporter would be able to use tools to find out information. Drug discovery, vaccine discovery would use AI to narrow down the possibilities. Then moving to the upper left would be the jobs that require high compassion, but not a lot of creativity. And these are jobs that include healthcare services, nurses, but also possibly the future of doctors and teachers may move in that dimension as AI takes over more of the analytical memory work, right? Because doctors cannot memorize all the permutations of diseases, nor all the drugs that are being discovered, nor target towards a particular person's DNA sequencing for a targeted treatment. AI can do a much better job at that. So in due time, this will reinvent the doctor's job as more of a compassionate caregiver, and similarly for teachers and other jobs. So this will be symbiotic. This can create more touching. Teachers there'll be fewer students for each teacher. There'll be more connections. The teacher will be more interesting job, intimate job. And then, of course, lastly, there's the upper right, which are the high compassion and high creative jobs that AI cannot do. So AI will also be a tool to help people who are fortunate to be in those jobs with 2 attributes that cannot be replaced.
I mean, it's a fascinating map, and it's one of the first maps, as you said, visualizations that I've run across. And I want to tell our audience that a place that you can read about this is in Kaifu's article, Blueprint of Human and AI Coexistence, which is in Wired magazine. So it's available to everyone. But Nancy, I know you wanted to jump in. Please go ahead.
Yeah, here's the rub, I think. We have a lot of empirical research showing that jobs that involve a lot of empathy and compassion pay less. They pay less even controlling for level of education and experience. And they pay less partly because a lot of them are done by women, but it's not, the pay penalty isn't limited to women. There are things about our labor market and our cultural norms that lead to the devaluation of that work that requires a lot of compassion. One factor is that often they're creating a social benefit rather than a private benefit. It's hard to capitalize or to actually capture the benefits of an individual effort or individual innovation. And another, I think, is that we've defined creativity very much in terms of the realm of cognitive innovation and skill. And there's an enormous scope for creativity in social interaction. I mean, there's nothing more challenging, actually, than trying to work with an autistic child or to deal with a person who is suffering from dementia. So I want to really emphasize that a lot of jobs that require compassion and empathy also require an amount of education and creativity and skill, but that it's undervalued by our market economy in many ways.
Well, let me ask you all a question related to that, because I think, one of the questions we talked a week or so ago, and I find this haunting question out there, which is, as Erik said, AI is what we want it to be. It's going to do it what we want it to be. That there's certain elements of proactive design, and whether or not, Nancy, what you just shared about how some key aspects of our social glue are undervalued, underinvested in, undersupported. We also have communities, particularly communities of color. We have incredible inequality in many societies. Whether or not this coming platform gives us the ability to rewire some of those elements of the social contract and to rewire some of the way this works, I don't know. I mean, I see you shaking your head, and I'm not saying it will happen. I just want to know. Okay. I mean, because this reminds. Go ahead, Nancy.
Let me just give you an analogy, okay? It's like thinking about AI as the solution to this problem is like thinking about agricultural innovation as the way to solve hunger. So what solves, what's behind the hunger problem in the US? We know there's been a tremendous spike in food insecurity in low-income households. It has nothing to do with agriculture. It has nothing to do with technology. It has nothing to do with what's available. It has to do with the way in which we distribute resources. And I don't want to see the discussion of AI displace the point that Erik is making about it's the way we use it. But it's not just the way we individually use it. It's the way we socially construct an algorithm for trying to reduce inequality and poverty, or whether we fail to do that.
I mean, I think it's a very, very important point. Yeah, jump in, Erik.
Yeah, well, let me build on what Nancy is saying and maybe say it in a little more optimistic way. One of the great things about the agricultural revolution, the green revolution, was it gave us the potential to feed the planet, which wasn't possible for most of human history. We haven't lived up to that potential, but at least it provided an opportunity for us to do that. And similarly, AI and other technologies have the potential for providing shared prosperity for lots and lots of people, for everybody, in fact. And then the question is, will we use the technology in a way that does that? Nancy's exactly right that one of the difficulties is that I love the market. It does many, many wonderful things, but it fails in many other areas. And over time, the traditional way we've used the market is working well in a smaller and smaller share of what we do. And we need to use other mechanisms. We have lots of other mechanisms to help make sure that people are better off. I mean, obviously, the government can play a huge role in helping people out with everything from the earned income tax credit to universal basic income to all sorts of safety net features like universal health care and education. These are all tools that we've been using, frankly, back since the early 1800s when America pioneered the world in introducing mass public education and reskilling or upskilling millions of people when the rest of the world didn't think it was a good idea. But there are so many opportunities for us to go beyond the market that I'm actually optimistic that the surplus and the value that we can create with these more powerful tools will give us an opportunity to have a lot more people a lot better off.
One of the things that I think is out there, would love to get Kaifu's in this, but I guess my own exploration of, how can we get better algorithms, right, to address some of what Nancy's talking about. I began as a publisher, as a guy in media looking for voices. So I met this incredible person in the Bay Area, Katika Roy. She has a company called Pipeline Equity, and it's designed to apply AI systems and methodology to gender equity in large-scale firms. So he said, you're never going to get gender fairness and gender equity and pay in small scale. That people may mean well, but you're not going to get it at scale. So it's looking at, for instance, gender justice, if you will, using AI and achieving scale. Or a company like Checker, which does background checks and does a lot of the stuff in human resources. Many human resources programs and departments are so risk averse that the question is, how do you get people that, got arrested for pot or have had some speed bump in their life or didn't come from the right zip code? There are algorithms built against them. And so they actually began to look at how do we create a more inclusive, less discriminatory and less biased system. So rather than algorithms reinforcing, the narrow bands of discrimination and bias beginning to look. So Kaifu, how let me just put it this way. How naive am I that there may be scaling algorithms that might begin to address some of these areas that Nancy says will be resilient problems and challenges?
Well, I do think there will be new uses of AI that can, I think today people think of AI as being relatively biased, causing problems. And I think the first step is to fix them, right? We've heard about examples where certain companies prefer to hire men because they didn't train it with enough women. And we've heard cases where certain races were not recognized properly because of the lack of training data. I think those problems are very fixable by building tools that will ensure proper coverage of demographics, of race and gender and age and so on. So there will be greater fairness. I also believe that at an individual decision maker level, ultimately we should be able to make AI on the average fairer than the person, because the biases can be removed. Well, first you can minimize the bias by fairly distributing the data set. Secondly, if there are some things that you think is bias causing, you can remove that from the consideration. So if you're trying to filter job applicants and you're very afraid there's something that will discriminate against women, you can remove the gender from one of the features being considered. So artificially you can at least try your best to remove that kind of bias. So I think those things are doable, but they're more at a company and individual level. I think what Susan's talking about is more if as a society we discriminate against, Nancy, discriminate against service jobs or against jobs held by women. It's a systemic issue, and then I think it probably cannot be corrected by AI. Probably more like government policy or trying to create demand or redistribute wealth. Those probably would be the ways to do it. But I'd leave it to the economists to answer that.
No,
Erik, we're going to move.
Help us figure it out.
Go ahead, Nancy. Go ahead, Nancy.
I just think I just have this, it's true. I'm very frustrated with the human species in general. And I just would like to have people who are experts in AI think a little bit more about how to redesign the whole system rather than just the little interface with corporate hiring. So actually, I am secretly a real techno-optimist in a kind of insane way, asking for help.
Yeah. Hey, Erik, I'd love you to come in on this. Go ahead, Erik.
Yeah, because Kaifu Lee said it very accurately that these tools have the potential to help a lot there as well. Right now, many of them are implemented in a biased way. We have to remember humans are biased. The reason the systems are often so biased and discriminate is because they're trained on data of humans that we're discriminating. One of the things that AI does, it's not a magic tool, but it forces you to be a lot more explicit, and it allows you to be testable and reproducible. You can see what the effects are. And this at least has the potential for you can go back and say, wait a minute, we're systematically making certain kinds of errors. And then it's up to us. Do we want to implement it in line with a different set of values? Do we want to put in the effort to redesign the system to be more unbiased? I want to be realistic. We'll never have systems that are completely unbiased. In fact, there's a mathematical theorem that it's impossible to eliminate all let's call it false positives and all false negatives at the same time when the samples are different. But what the systems do is make it explicit what kinds of trade-offs you want to make. And I think that the broad direction is already and will be more and more to eliminate many kinds of biases. But as I said earlier, it's going to depend on us deciding to use the tools in these ways. They won't automatically, magically eliminate bias.
So my question is how to do that, Erik, and all of you. Brad Smith, the current president of Microsoft, wrote a book called Tools and Weapons, and in it argued that AI and this future technological set of options we're going to have can be used and weaponized in a way against societies, against individuals. or can be used as a way we do it. And so he had very much the same approach you had. But he also said in this book that Microsoft elected not to cooperate with China when it asked to Microsoft's help on facial recognition software and its social capital system and whatnot. And Brad said that they walked away. So it raises this really interesting question of which ecosystem, which sets of rules that compete. Right now, Europe has the GDPR and has, a greater set of standards on privacy than probably any other, large economy in the world, certainly more than the United States and certainly more than China and elsewhere. So I guess the question is, we look at AI coming along and we can talk somewhat, in sort of a gravity-free way that we ought to control this, we ought to make rules. But what if another company in another ecosystem that's globally competitive makes rules that more of the world uses than may be happening here in the United States? How do you deal with those geopolitical tensions about fighting about what those rules ought to be?
Well, I applaud what Brad did, which is to take responsibility for how the tools are used. There's a story, maybe it's apocryphal, that during the late World War II, someone asked the missile engineers what if they were worried about what the deaths that they might cause. And supposedly the engineer said, well, our job is to send the missiles up. Where they come down to someone else's department. And I think that's obviously not the attitude that you'd want among missile engineers. I don't think it's the attitude you want about AI researchers or other. At Stanford, we've created the new Digital Economy Lab to bring together AI researchers as part of, and economists and social scientists and ethicists to understand these questions better as part of the Human-Centered AI initiative. And what you're doing here with this panel, bringing together people from different perspectives, I think everyone has to take a responsibility. When AI was a small niche technology that had little effect on the world, it was okay for people just to say, hey, we're just working on what it's doing. Now, I think everyone has to be conscious about, are these systems going to be abused in different ways? Are they going to be weaponized? And make decisions whether or not they want to be part of systems, whether they're from other countries, they're our own country, different corporations that may not have the kinds of effects on society that we want to. And that's a tough position to be put into, but it's something that as adults we have to do every day when we make decisions about how we live our lives.
Kaifu, your thoughts?
The dilemma we face is that AI works better with all the data aggregated. If you don't aggregate the data, you can't get the best models. And the GDPR, sort of the vision is to give all the data back to the individual who owns his or her private data, which is certainly true. And then that data in turn gets licensed into application that he or she trusts. But I think the naivete of such an approach is, I don't know what applications I trust. So you can't delegate that back to the individual, because we individuals can't evaluate every website and every use. We don't know which website is good and which one's evil. So I think a lot of these problems really need to think about whether we can use technology to at least partially solve the problems that technology causes. For example, can I have an AI agent that knows what I want and therefore gives the data to the apps that it thinks I'm willing to trade my privacy for convenience? Another aspect that technology can be used is, what if we take technologies that allows us to have our cake and eat it too? A new technology called Federated Learning. It's still in its early stages, but the idea is you keep your data in trusted environments, and it's used for AI for training, but it never leaves trusted environments. Only the trained models and the parameters leave. So in the most extreme case, my data trains on my phone, and my personal data never leaves, but it computes things to send to Google and Facebook. And the more likely cases, in a healthcare case, my data would be used only in my hospital to whom I've trusted my data, but the hospitals can aggregate their models across hospitals. None of these are guaranteed or perfect solutions, but I think we cannot think of only using regulations to solve the problem. I think it should be regulation along technologies that can make this better.
Nancy, do you see ways in which the care economy, given what Erik and Kaifu have just shared, can plug in and get proactive in terms of securing, interests in which this world they're describing might be empowering for the care economy as opposed to constraining?
I don't think we can put the responsibility for that on the care economy, as it were. But I think the pandemic has really dramatized our dependence on a kind of hidden care economy in ways that might enable us to rethink the way we're organizing ourselves. It's really hard for us to decide as a society what we're going to prioritize. And the whole, horrible conflict over wearing masks in the US is a really good example of that. Somehow we have to learn to cooperate more effectively. We have a lot of problems that we can only solve by cooperating. And somehow our ability to cooperate seems to be becoming progressively impaired for reasons that we don't really fully understand. But if we don't figure it out, if we don't find a better algorithm for cooperation, I think all of these problems, technology, care, the environment, they're all going to basically be the end of us.
Well, I just yesterday did an interview with Alex Gibney, who won the Academy Award for one of his previous documentaries, and just did a thing on the COVID crisis called Totally Under Control. And I just encourage everyone to watch it, because when you look at the breakdown in decision making, and also, essentially the politicization of decision as opposed to respect for science, whatever, I think it's a very relevant part of this discussion when you come and begin thinking about public policy and what equities matter in the society we're building. Kaifu and Erik, when you kind of look at the response on the COVID crisis, I almost would have preferred to have an AI machine making the decisions rather than any of these characters in the White House. And so, as we think about and elevate, this notion that somehow, human beings with sensitivities and, empathy and emotion or something better, I have to tell you, it would not have taken much to get that ecosystem to produce better results, at least in the United States, than we did. Maybe South Korea, maybe China, used some of that. But your thoughts on collective decision making, and I would say the political distortion of away from optimal outcomes.
Well, I understand that temptation that if we get AI to come save us, but that AI is not coming to save us. It's on us. It's our responsibility. I was talking to some of the leaders in Congress about some of the problems that we're facing, and they said, I agree with you, and we need to do this, but I got to listen to my constituents, and that's not what I'm hearing from them. And you know what? In a way, that's not cowardly. That's partly the way democracy is supposed to work. So if we have an election in the United States coming up in about actually 1 week, a lot of people have already voted. If we want to change, or if we want to do things differently, then we have a tool for doing that. Not enough people have been doing that. And of course, technology has been part of the disinformation that's been leading to a lot of confusion. But I still think that that's ultimately where power lies, is in people, driving their political leaders to be in line with their values. And we need to not give up on that. I think we need to double down on that, especially this week.
Well, great.
I would add that I think the pandemic is kind of a global health crisis. And as we know from management schools, during crisis, you need a strong centralized management style to get you out of the crisis. So right. I think when the government decides to let every state do its own thing, and then to let Google and Apple figure out contact tracing, then you're not maximizing the efficiency. And I'm certainly not talking about forms of government. I'm just saying, can it be that during periods of emergency, that more centralization is needed? Take as an example a democracy in Korea, or Taiwan for that matter. Right. There were laws passed during the SARS period that the next time when the similar pandemic is reached, then people the government will take over the right to track everybody's location as a way to minimize the spread of the disease. And after the pandemic's over, the tracking ends, the data is deleted. So that was passed as a law in certain countries and regions, and they did a great job in tracing. So I think the question is this perfect individual freedom and distributed model of decision-making really appropriate during periods of a serious emergency?
Right. Well, thank you for that. Let me go to the questions now. We have lots of questions, so I'm going to ask our panel to be succinct in responding so we can get through as many as we can. The first is from Matthew Kolvicki of INET. Lee has said in the past how AI may end some jobs but keep the most human ones. And Nancy Fulbrey speaks to so well on the jobs that are undervalued or not valued at all. How do we place value on the jobs Lee sees as the future and Fulbrey sees as value? So quick, we've kind of addressed some of this, but Nancy, quick thoughts?
Well, I think the first step that we need to take is stop being so dictated by the market and market forces and realize that we need to set a high minimum wage for certain kinds of jobs in order to reduce turnover, improve quality, improve equity, and so forth. So I think the answer to that question really kind of lies in that arena of social policy that Erik was talking about.
Kaifu, any quick comment on that?
Well, I'm still a little, maybe because I'm not an economist, I'm still a little bit hopeful that the market will also contribute to this over time. If you think about, truck driver jobs are going away, so there'll be no more jobs available. And on the other hand, we know that healthcare jobs will be increasing. So there should be some invisible market forces that shift people and change wages. But I'm all for increasing the minimum wage as well.
Okay, we have Jay Pocklington, also of INET. How do we think about the notion of ownership and private property in a digital world, Erik?
Well, as I said earlier, the economics of bits are very different than the economics of atoms. And there are opportunities there for widely shared access to information. For instance, we all have access to Wikipedia and other global information, billions of people. Also, we all can contribute to it. It would be dysfunctional if we put up artificial property rights that prevented people from sharing them. At the same time, a economic system that just has everything available for free has issues about how do you get people to pay for it? How do you pay for the generation of that? And that's the fundamental tension that's underlying there. And there are a whole set of different business models that are being evolved. And then there's some technological solutions. Kaifu mentioned these federated learning systems and others. But just as the market system really started becoming dominant, a couple hundred years ago, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations as a new set of approaches to creating wealth came on. We need to reinvent our own system now, move beyond, as Nancy was saying, just the narrow definition of the market system and look at some of these alternative business models. I think government being involved in supporting things, an example of Wikipedia where people are willing to volunteer and free and open source. There are business models that are supported by advertising and by donations. There are a whole set of other business models. And yes, in some cases, introducing property rights. But we want to be careful not to just try to force fit the traditional way of having very tight property rights on everything, say through copyright and patents, onto an information sector world, because then you're sort of throwing away one of the biggest benefits of the digital economy.
Thank you for that. Kaifu, I'm going to direct this next question to you from Elizabeth Chi at the University of Sheffield. She says, do you see any danger of society pushing too much of this AI stuff to the point where no one wants to study anything else, and we end up with a glut of folks in that area, or a divide, just everyone in that area? It's sort of a question of, will this fad drive an over saturation of talent into this direction? You're the businessman here, so how do you see it?
Not to worry too much. I think, a few years ago, an AI engineer really made twice or three times as much as other computer engineers. So naturally, all the people flooded and into the major. But now I think the difference is much smaller. The tools are much more commonplace, and I think things ought to balance out. I do think some access to AI as a tool is probably more important than as a programming. So just like the computer science, we didn't all become computer programmers, right? Computer tools became Photoshop for photographers, Word for journalists, and so on. And I think AI will end up being tools that people use rather than everybody become a coder. That's what the future ought to be.
Yeah, let me underscore that. Kaifu's exactly right. There's so much potential for AI to help essentially every occupation, but that doesn't mean you all have to master TensorFlow or neural nets. It means that we can access these tools in ways that amplify and augment what we're already doing or what we'd like to do.
Thank you for that. Rick McGahey, who's at the Schwartz Center, and I think it's the New School. Rick, I can't see the whole thing, so I assume it's the New School. Rick says he agrees with Nancy that AI introduction and rewards from power controlled by capital, what is valued in the market, et cetera. Technology always is a point of conflict between work and rewards and profit. He says we don't control AI, owners of technology do. How do we get a greater share of AI to most people and shape and design AI up front, not just argue for redistributing funds afterwards? I'm going to throw that to Erik because you were sort of addressing that earlier.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet here, but I think just asking the question is halfway to the answer, and that is recognizing that there's no automatic law of economics that says we're going to have broadly shared prosperity if we just let the market go. In fact, it's quite possible, if you go through all the economic textbooks and theories, that even as the pie gets ever bigger and bigger, the benefits go to a smaller and smaller group. That's not what happened in most of history, but it has happened over the past 20 years, especially the past 5 or 10 years. It's going to require, I think that I wouldn't throw away the redistribution lever. That's a very powerful one, but it also is going to require investment, especially in human capital, so we have more people who have the kinds of skills that they can contribute and capture some of the value directly through the market system.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask this for Nancy and Kaifu. What are the implications? This is from Akbar Noman from Columbia University. What are the implications for developing countries with abundant labor whose comparative advantage lies still in labor-intensive products? So thoughts on that front? Nancy?
Well, the International Division of Labor and international inequality is really the biggest elephant in the room, I think, in this whole discussion. And I don't know the answer to the question. I'm not sure how even to think about it, but I'm really glad it's gotten raised because I think it's really, really central. I see Erik has his finger up.
Let me just briefly say
please
this.
Go ahead.
Mike Spence and I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago that highlighted this problem. And the issue is that historically, labor rich countries have been able to boost their incomes by doing a lot of labor-intensive work, textiles and other areas, and that got them on a path. It was the first rung of a ladder towards development. Now that rung is being removed because robots can, as Kaifu was saying, and as we saw in our science article, robots and other technologies can do a lot of that sort of routine, relatively simple structured work. And now these companies have to make a much bigger leap towards doing more sophisticated services and design. And that's just a lot harder step. Now, some countries are already mostly on the other side of that. Kaifu in China and Korea and other countries that have developed. We see Vietnam is trying to make that move. But it has the potential for really leaving a big percentage of the world's population behind if they can't make that kind of a leap.
So
Thank you.
I would add that the days of outsourcing routine work to other countries will be over soon. China outsourced manufacturing, India outsourced BPO and other types of white-collar outsourcing. But these are the type of jobs precisely targeted by automation and AI. So I think these types of white collar and blue collar outsourcing of relatively lower unskilled work will be over. I would ask the question of whether service can be outsourced. We see some examples of some countries exporting nannies and homemakers to other countries. It's probably somewhat disruptive, but I would imagine as wealth inequality increases among countries, service outsourcing might be something that would bring some degree of improved economy for the poorer countries.
Thank you. Jack Gao from INET, who was helpful in putting this program together today, said, this seems to be an age of tech giants. Can the panel talk specifically about the features, roles, responsibility of tech superstar companies today? And I'll piggyback on that just a week ago, the Department of Justice wrote to Google and said, watch out, we're coming after you. So how do you look at particularly the sort of these large platforms that are out there, and what their roles and what the government, potential government challenge to them should be? Let me start with Kaifu and just go around the circuit real quick.
I think we've now learned self-discipline is probably not going to work, because these companies haven't. Imagine you're the CEO, you've got this wonderful tool that can optimize eyeballs, minutes, revenue, and you're just going to use that to the extent you can. So separating the companies, and that won't work either. I would like to think a couple of possible solutions. One is, what if there can be some kind of supervision? What if somebody published the percentage of Facebook that is fake news, or percentage of Google searches that are spam? That is an external metric that forces them to fix the problem. Otherwise, they lose their users and customers. The other is some exploration into AI that can be of a long-term metric. Some people have suggested, rather than measuring how many clicks and minutes and eyeballs and revenue, we could measure if we think our time is well spent, or if we feel we've grown. It's a very difficult, but I think some research in the area might make objective functions that help us become better people, rather than fall into the externalities of these giant internet companies.
Nancy, thoughts on that front?
Change corporate charter rules. Force companies like that to be ruled by boards that include representatives of their workers and their consumers. Figure out some flexible way to democratize that company.
And Erik?
Well, I think those are some great suggestions by both Nancy and Kaifu. Let me add a couple more. One is, we need to fundamentally rethink how we measure the economy. In particular, the value and nature of digital goods, free goods, it's not captured well in any of our statistics. Secondly, one of the reasons these companies have become so dominant is some fundamental economics, in particular network effects. I think we all know that a bigger network creates more value than a smaller network, and somebody who controls a bigger network is able to become ever more powerful and becomes a self-reinforcing system. So you get these winner-take-all or winner-take-most markets. The answer is not to destroy the network. I wouldn't want to have a network that, say, Facebook, where I couldn't connect to my nieces and nephews because they're on a different network. The answer is actually to create interoperability. And this is a place where the market system breaks down. It's not in the interest of private companies to have the level of interoperability that's socially optimal. I'll give you a quick example. There was about 10 years ago, it used to be difficult to move your telephone number from one mobile phone operator to another phone operator in the United States. And there was encouragement, nudging, jawboning to let people make it easier to move. And the operators were saying, no, it's too hard. Our servers are going to melt down if we had to be able to use another person's number. Ultimately, the government stepped in and said, we're going to mandate mobile phone number portability. And very quickly, they went ahead and did that. That made it lower switching costs, led to more competition, and ultimately, it was a solution that took away some of the market power. We could have interoperability among social networks, among chat systems, among many of the other systems. It would preserve the network effects, but it would take away the monopoly power.
Thank you for that. I think it's been such a rich discussion, but Elizabeth Chi out there at the University of Sheffield wrote something very generous that I want to share with all of you. She says, "Thank you to all the panelists for your thoughtful and well-measured perspectives. I wish all of you had spoken at the World Health Summit session on using AI for pandemic preparedness. They would have benefited from your respectful interaction and well-balanced perspectives spanning tech, business, academia, public sector. Thank you again." So Elizabeth, I thought it was worthy enough to share with everyone because I felt exactly the same way. We are at the end of our time, and there are many, many other questions that have been posed, but I think we've done as good enough. Though I should say to my friend Rick McGahee, who said, "I'm thoughtful, naive." I said, "I'm always thoughtful, but naive." But I would love to just sort of encapsulate this question on which I don't know what needles we move today, but I think that the different perspectives that each of you brought about what we need to solve, what part of human society can be enhanced and empowered, how we can begin thinking about where to direct those we train to different parts of this, how to get the social contract written and done in better ways, and how, as Rick McGahee was saying, how to protect those people who could very much be victims of this. And Nancy said, I think is very, very important. So I want to thank Erik Brynjolfsson at Stanford Digital Economy Lab, Nancy Fulbrey at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Kaifu Lee with Sinovation Ventures, and his new book, which I highly recommend and I have, called AI Superpowers. I would have loved to have spent another hour talking about what these big stakeholders in this are going to do and what we should be really worried about when this becomes a point of superpower competition. I think the terms of trade will be different. So thank you very much for that. I also want to tell everyone that on November 10th, this series will continue, and the session there is Who's Not Afraid of Robots, a comparison of national models with Richard Baldwin, Leif Pragrotsky, and Gillian Tett of the Financial Times. You can register at the right of your screen, or you can follow up on the INET website, and the organizers ask you to follow at INET Economics to hear more about this series and the future of work. So thank you, Kaifu, Nancy, and Erik. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful discussion. Thanks for our audience as well.
Thank you.